The notice arrived on a Tuesday, which Nora Callaway would later remember, because Tuesdays had always been the worst kind of ordinary. Not the dramatic collapse of a Monday or the slow suffocation of a Wednesday. Just a Tuesday, pale and indifferent, slipping an eviction notice under a door that wasn't even hers anymore. She read it twice in the hallway of the Sunridge Apartments in Elko, Nevada, where the carpet smelled of old cigarettes and the overhead light had been flickering for 6 months without anyone fixing it. Her daughter May stood beside her, one hand wrapped around the strap of her backpack, the other holding the remains of a granola bar she'd been nursing since breakfast. May was 7 years old, and she had her father's dark eyes and her mother's way of going very still when she sensed something was wrong. "Mama, what does that paper say?" Nora folded it once, twice, and pressed it into the back pocket of her jeans. "Nothing important, baby. Let's go." But May had already seen her mother's hands shake, and May, who had learned to read rooms and silences and the particular quality of her mother's stillness, understood without understanding precisely what that paper meant. They had 30 days. It would take them 11. Nora Callaway had not always been the kind of woman who received eviction notices. There was a version of her life, not even 3 years behind her, that would have been entirely unrecognizable in that flickering hallway. She had been a hotel accountant, good at it. She had worn blazers to work and eaten lunch at a desk with a view of the Humboldt River and attended parent-teacher conferences with confidence, the kind that came from knowing exactly how much was in your checking account and when the mortgage was due, and that both of those numbers were reliable. Then the Riverside Grand Hotel had been bought by a national chain, and the national chain had brought its own accounting software and its own accounting staff. And in November of the year May turned 4, Nora had been handed a severance check and a parking validation and a handshake from a man in a corporate polo who had never learned her name. She found work at a payroll firm. Then the payroll firm restructured. She found work at a car dealership doing their books. So then the dealership owner's nephew needed a job. She drove for a delivery service. She took bookkeeping clients on the side. She enrolled in an online certification course to update her credentials and paid for it on a credit card she told herself she would pay down just as soon as things stabilized. And things never stabilized. And the credit card balance grew the way debt does, quietly and with terrible patience. Until one day she looked at the number and understood that it had become a living thing that she owed more to than she earned in 2 months. May's father had left when May was 2, not dramatically. He hadn't yelled or slammed doors or given Nora any particular moment to point to as the end. He had simply become less present and then absent, and the child support came irregularly, and then not at all. And Nora had learned not to depend on something that arrived like weather, without schedule or warning. By the time they lost the apartment on Sunridge, Nora had $214 in her checking account, a 2011 Honda CR-V with a failing alternator, a storage unit holding the pieces of the life they used to have, and a daughter who had begun asking questions that Nora could not always answer, without the words catching somewhere behind her sternum. "Are we poor, Mama?" "We're going through a hard time, baby. Do poor people have hard times?" "Everybody has hard times." May had considered this. Then, "Do we have more hard times than other people?" Nora had said, "We have each other." Which was not an answer, and May knew it was not an answer. And the look on her daughter's face in that moment had lodged itself in Nora's chest like a splinter she could not reach. They slept in the CR-V for 19 days. She found spots carefully. The Walmart on Idaho Street allowed overnight parking without harassment. The rest stop at mile marker 218 on I-80 had a bathroom with running water and a vending machine that took cards. She drove May to school every morning and waited in the parking lot until the last possible moment to make sure her daughter walked in clean, with her homework done, with a lunch packed, with nothing on her face that would invite the particular cruelty children showed to other children who were different. She became an expert in invisibility, a skill that had no resume line, that no certification course could teach, but that she mastered with the same quiet competence she had once applied to balance sheets. She knew which truck stop showers cost $3 and which cost $4, and which ones had towels that didn't smell of mildew. She knew that the Elko Public Library opened at 9 on weekdays and had strong Wi-Fi and no questions asked, and she drove May there on Saturdays when school wasn't the excuse. And she knew, the way people who have been compressed by difficulty come to know things, that something had to change, that survival without a plan was just slow collapse with better scenery. It was at the library that she found the listing. She had been searching for rental properties in Elko County, combing through aggregator sites with the grimly focused energy of someone who has spent too many nights watching the ceiling of their car. She had $48 in available credit on the Visa. She had a month and a half of back storage unit fees. She had May. The listing was not on any of the rental sites. It appeared in a sidebar advertisement for the Elko County Tax Assessor's Office, which was running a notice about its quarterly surplus property auction. The properties were tax-delinquent parcels the county had seized for non-payment, and the county, in its bureaucratic practicality, simply wanted them off the books. Most of the listings were vacant lots. Some were agricultural parcels without water rights, which meant they were essentially decorative dirt. There was a mobile home unit with what appeared to be significant fire damage. And there, near the bottom of the list, almost as an afterthought, was a property described as follows: Hartwell Placer and Lode Mining Claim, 11.4 acres, Silver Basin Road, Elko County. Historical designation: structures present, condition unknown. Minimum opening bid: $1. No current tax liability assessed due to federal mining claim overlap. County seeking administrative release of interest only. $1. Nora read the description 3 times. Then she looked up Silver Basin Road on the map. It was 41 miles northeast of Elko. The road was unpaved for the last 9 miles. The satellite view showed a high desert landscape, punctuated by rocky outcroppings and sparse juniper, with what appeared to be a collapsed wooden structure at the end of a faint track, and behind it, cut into the face of a low granite ridge, the dark rectangular shadow of a mine opening. She looked at the auction date. It was in 4 days. She looked at May, who was sitting at the next table drawing horses in a notebook, her tongue at the corner of her lip in the way it went when she was concentrating. Nora sat back in the library chair and pressed her palms flat against the table and breathed in the particular smell of old books and industrial carpet and the stale coffee someone had brought in from outside. And she thought about the $48 and the failing alternator and the 19 nights in the parking lot and the splinter behind her sternum that was the look on her daughter's face. She thought, "It is probably nothing." She thought, "It is certainly nothing." And she thought, "But $1 is $1." The Elko County tax auction was held in a conference room at the County Administration Building on Court Street, a low beige building that smelled of municipal efficiencies and old carpet and too much air conditioning. There were 14 people registered to bid. Nora had looked them up as best she could from the auction registration list, which was public record. 3 were real estate investors she recognized from local property sales data. 2 were land speculators she found on LinkedIn with profiles that described them as natural resources professionals. Several were locals she could not identify. She had worn her best blazer, which lived in a garment bag in the back of the CRV, pressed but starting to show wear at the elbows. May was at school, Now, Nora had told the school secretary she had a medical appointment and would pick May up at the regular time. The county auctioneer was a thin man named Gerald, with reading glasses on a lanyard, and the brisk, affectless cadence of a person who conducts auctions the way other people file taxes, competently, without ceremony, and with no illusions about its glamour. They moved through the properties in order. The vacant lots generated modest bidding from the real estate investors, and then silence. The agricultural parcels prompted some interest, and then even more silence when the lack of water rights was reiterated. The fire-damaged mobile home sold for $600 to a man in a Carhartt jacket who appeared to have been bidding out of reflex. Then Gerald reached item 14. He read the description of the Hartwell placer and lode mining claim with the same flat efficiency he had brought to everything else. $1 opening bid. Do I have $1? Nora raised her paddle. Gerald waited. The room was quiet. The real estate investors did not move. The natural resources professionals did not move. A woman near the back shuffled papers. Someone coughed. $1. Do I have 2? Nothing. Going once, going twice. And that was it. She owned an 11-acre mining claim on Silver Basin Road for $1, a transaction that took considerably longer to process in paperwork than it had to complete in bidding, and which cost her $12 in recording fees that she put on the visa and tried not to think about. She was walking back to the CRV when she passed 2 of the real estate investors in the parking lot. One of them had clearly been at the auction. He glanced at her folder with the property transfer documents visible inside and said to his colleague, loud enough for her to hear, "That mine's been abandoned since 1987. Whole shafts probably collapsed. So that lady just paid $12 for a hole in the ground." The other man laughed. The particular laugh of people who find other people's decisions amusing in the way that makes them feel better about their own. Nora got in the CRV. She sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel. Then she pulled up the satellite image of Silver Basin Road on her phone and studied the dark rectangular shadow in the granite face and the collapsed wooden structure and the pale desert scrub spreading out in every direction under the white Nevada sun. A hole in the ground. She drove to pick up May. She told her daughter that evening in the Walmart parking lot, with the windows cracked and the last of the sunset going orange behind the mountains, and a bag of groceries between them on the center console. Nora had made the decision to tell May the truth about most things. This had not always been easy, but she had come to believe that children raised on comfortable lies were not better protected from the world, only less prepared for it. Mama bought something today. May was eating crackers from the box, one at a time, with great deliberateness. "What did you buy?" "A property. Land, out in the desert. It has an old mine on it." May stopped eating crackers. She looked at her mother with the dark, serious eyes she'd inherited from a man who no longer remembered her birthday. Like a real mine? Like with gold? Maybe. Probably not. Old mines are usually just old. But it's ours. 11 acres. May thought about this. Are we going to live there? Nora looked through the windshield at the Walmart parking lot, so at the shopping carts corralled under the orange lights, at the families pushing purchases to their cars, at the ordinary machinery of ordinary lives. I don't know yet. I want to go look at it first. Is it safe, Mama? The question landed with unexpected weight. I don't know that either. We'll find out. May ate another cracker. She said, "Mama, what's an acre?" About the size of a football field. May considered this information with great seriousness. We own 11 football fields? Give or take. May looked mildly impressed despite herself, which was exactly the right response. And Nora felt the splinter behind her sternum shift, just slightly, as though something had begun, very slowly, to move. She drove out to Silver Basin Road on a Saturday. May beside her in the passenger seat with a book she wasn't reading because the landscape outside the window kept demanding her attention. The paved road ended at a junction marked only by a faded BLM sign, and after that, they were on hard-packed caliche that turned to washboard and then to something barely definable as a road at all, rising through high desert that smelled of sage and hot stone and the particular dry clarity that Nevada carries in its air like a constant disclosure. May pressed her nose to the glass. "There's nothing out here, Mama." "That's not nothing. That's desert." "Same thing." "It's not, actually. The desert is full of things. You just have to know how to look." May accepted this with the polite skepticism of a 7-year-old who had not yet been given reason to believe it. The property was marked by a wooden post with a metal claim tag that had been there long enough to develop a patina of rust along its edges, the numbers still legible if you squinted. The faint track that served as a driveway curved around a jumble of granite boulders and then straightened, and there it was. The structure that appeared in the satellite image as a collapsed wooden form was, in person, more nuanced than that characterization suggested. It had been a building once, clearly. A single-story frame structure of rough board lumber, perhaps 20 feet wide and 30 deep, that had experienced partial roof collapse at its rear section, but maintained the front third with a stubbornness that spoke to the quality of its original construction. The boards were silvered gray with decades of weathering. The windows were glassless, dark rectangles through which the desert wind moved freely. The door was missing, leaving an open threshold through which you could see the earthen floor inside, dark and hard-packed, littered with debris that had blown in or fallen from the damaged roof. Behind it, perhaps 40 feet back, was the mine. The opening had been cut by hand into the face of the granite ridge, a labor she could not comprehend until she was standing in front of it and understood, in her body rather than her mind, what it meant that men had once chipped this entrance from solid rock with hammers and iron chisels. It was 8 feet wide and perhaps 7 feet tall, framed on the sides and across the top with heavy timber that had darkened to the color of charcoal over its decades of exposure. Across the entrance, at chest height, and someone had strung a length of orange construction fencing that had faded to a muted pink, attached at either side to the timber frame with rusted wire. A sign, weathered nearly to illegibility, read, "Danger. Abandoned mine opening. No entry." May stood at her mother's shoulder and looked at the entrance to the mine. "Is it safe, Mama?" Nora looked at the timber frame, which appeared intact. She looked at the ground in front of the opening, which showed no significant subsidence or cracking. She looked at the fencing, which was deterrence rather than barrier. "I don't know yet. What's in there? Old mine stuff, probably. Timbers. Maybe old equipment. But maybe gold?" Nora smiled despite herself. "Maybe. Probably not. But let's look at the cabin first." May shadowed her through the open doorway of the building, which Nora had already decided to call the cabin, because that word implied a kind of intentionality that the word structure did not, and she found, to her genuine surprise, that the front section of the building was more intact than it appeared from outside. The roof here was complete, a lattice of rough-hewn rafters supporting boards that had dried and settled, but not failed. The floor was dirt, swept clean by decades of wind coming through the empty windows. The walls were solid. Someone had built this with real knowledge, fitting the corner joints with a precision that had outlasted the person who made them. Against the north wall stood a cast-iron stove on a stone pad, its legs crusted with rust, but its body whole, its firebox door hanging open on hinges that had corroded but not let go. Beside it, a pile of old wood, gray with age, still structurally sound. On the east wall, 2 shelves remained, empty but attached, set into the wall studs with iron brackets that had outlasted every object that had ever rested on them. Nora walked the space slowly, pressing the wall boards with her palm to test their resistance, checking the floor for soft spots that might indicate rot below. The floor was solid, earth below, dry as chalk. May trailed her, running one finger along the wall. It smells old. It is old. This building might be 100 years old. May turned to her, eyes wide with the appropriate scale of that number. 100 years? Was there a civil war? The Civil War was before this. Then this would have been built around the time of... Nora searched her memory from a history class 2 decades behind her. The time of the Klondike. Gold Rush era. Were there cowboys? Definitely cowboys. May looked at the space with reassessed interest. She walked to the stove and crouched to peer inside the firebox, then straightened. Mama, could we live here? Nora looked at the open windows, at the collapsed rear section visible through a gap in the interior wall, at the dirt floor, at the November sky, visible in strips through the damaged roof beyond. She thought of the CRV. She thought of the Walmart parking lot and the library on Saturdays, and May eating crackers one at a time with great deliberateness. She said, I think we could make it into something. May looked at her with the measuring gaze she sometimes deployed when she wanted to assess whether her mother was telling her a useful truth or a protective one. Then she nodded, as though making a decision. Okay. Then they drove back to Elko, and Nora spent 3 days in the library researching, the way she had always attacked problems she did not yet understand. Systematically, without shortcuts, building knowledge the way she had once built financial reports, from the ground up with primary sources. She found the property records for the Hartwell mining claim, dating back to 1884, when a man named Elias Hartwell had filed the original claim with the Territorial Land Office. Hartwell had operated the mine sporadically through the 1890s, extracting silver ore in quantities that the historical records described as modest but consistent. She found a reference to him in a 1901 Nevada mining survey that described the Hartwell operation as one of several small independent claims in the Silver Basin District that had survived the silver price crash of 1893 through a combination of low operating costs and, the surveyor noted cryptically, unconventional methods of ore processing that Hartwell declined to elaborate upon. She found that the mine had changed hands twice after Hartwell's death in 1917. A mining company had acquired it in 1923 and extracted some quantity of ore through the late 1920s before the Depression rendered it uneconomical. Then a man named Raymond Coury had purchased the claim in 1941 and held it until his death in 1974, after which it had passed to his estate, which had failed to pay property taxes, which was how the county had eventually come to hold the administrative interest she had purchased for $1. Raymond Coury. When she searched the name and found relatively little, he appeared in a 1957 Elko Independent article about local property owners opposing a BLM grazing boundary adjustment. He appeared in a 1968 mining district newsletter as a dues-paying member. He appeared in his own obituary, which described him as a private man, a World War II veteran, a former employee of the Nevada test site during the 1950s, and the owner of a remote mining property in Elko County that he had, according to family members quoted in the obituary, visited regularly throughout his life without ever producing any documented mining income. Visited regularly, without documented income. Nora sat back from the library computer and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way she used to look at a spreadsheet when a number appeared that did not reconcile with the numbers around it. When a column didn't add up and you couldn't find the error until you looked at the data from a different angle. for a private man, a Nevada test site employee, a remote property visited regularly for 30 years without income. She looked up the Nevada test site. She read about what it had been in the 1950s. The American nuclear weapons testing facility located 90 miles northwest of Las Vegas, employing thousands of workers under classified protocols during the height of Cold War testing. She read about the elaborate logistics involved in transporting materials, equipment, and personnel to and from remote Nevada sites. She read that workers at the test site had often been required to maintain absolute confidentiality about the nature of their work, their movements, and the facilities they supported. Then she read something that made her pause. In the 1950s, particularly during the early years of above-ground testing, certain private and semi-private locations in rural Nevada had been used as equipment staging areas, material storage points, and what the historical documents called dispersal caches, locations where sensitive equipment, supplies, and in some cases strategic reserve materials were stored away from the primary test site complex as a hedge against the possibility of Soviet attack or facility compromise. She looked at this for a long time. Then she typed, "Elias Hartwell, Silver Mine, 1890s, Nevada Unusual." The search returned a single result of note, a 2003 post on a mining history forum, written by a man who described himself as a retired Nevada geological surveyor and recreational historian. He had been researching the Silver Basin District and had come across an interesting anomaly in the original survey records for the Hartwell claim, filed in 1884. Hartwell had registered not a standard load claim, but a combined placer and load claim, which was unusual for the district, and suggested he believed the property held both surface and deep ore deposits. More interesting to the historian was a secondary filing Hartwell had made in 1891, not a mining filing, but a water rights claim that described a subsurface water feature on the property, a below-grade basin that Hartwell had called in the filing the lower room. The lower room, the historian had written. I was never able to determine what Hartwell meant by this designation. The water rights filing described the feature as a natural subsurface chamber, approximately 60 feet below grade, accessible only through the mine shaft, with dimensions he estimated at 40 by 60 feet. This is an extraordinarily large natural chamber for the Silver Basin geology, and I have often wondered if Hartwell was mistaken in his measurements, or if the feature exists and simply has not been rediscovered. Nora read this 3 times. Then she closed the browser and sat very still in the library chair, while May drew horses at the next table, and the fluorescent lights hummed above them with their patient, indifferent buzz. A natural chamber 60 feet below grade, 40 by 60 feet. Raymond Curry, Nevada test site, dispersal caches, 30 years of regular visits, no documented income. She thought, it is probably nothing. She thought, it is certainly nothing. But the number did not reconcile, and she had been an accountant long enough to know what you did when a number did not reconcile. You looked harder. They moved onto the property 9 days after the auction. This was not a decision Nora had made lightly, or at all, in the way that major decisions are sometimes not made, but simply arrived at through the accumulated weight of smaller necessities. She had $31 in the checking account, 3 days of hotel credit on the visa that she refused to use except for genuine emergency, and a storage unit full of furniture, and a daughter who needed somewhere that was not a parking lot. The mine property was hers. The cabin, or the intact portion of it, was weatherproof in the sections that mattered. She had a camping stove and a sleeping bag, and her daughter's inexhaustible capacity to treat new circumstances as adventure rather than catastrophe, which was a resource she had come to depend on more than she would ever tell May, because it was not a child's job to be her mother's source of courage. She borrowed a truck from a co-worker at the delivery service she still occasionally worked, Linda, a broad-shouldered woman of few words and unstinting practical generosity, and drove the most essential items from the storage unit to Silver Basin Road in 2 loads. A folding table, 2 sleeping bags, a camp stove and propane canisters, a portable water filter she had bought 2 years ago for a camping trip they had never taken, the toolbox she had inherited from her own father, which contained a hammer, a pry bar, a set of screwdrivers, a tape measure, work gloves, and a headlamp that still held a charge, her laptop in its padded case, a cardboard box of books, May's and hers, because she had decided at some point that the books were not going into storage no matter what else had to go. She covered the open windows in plastic sheeting, weighted at the bottom with stones, while May carried smaller items from the truck. She cleaned the cabin floor with a brush she found in the rubble of the collapsed rear section, sweeping it until the dirt was smooth and consistent. She set up the camp stove on a flat stone outside the door, in a spot sheltered from wind by the angle of the building's south wall. That first night, with the sleeping bag spread on the cabin floor and the camp stove warming a pot of soup outside that she had carried in a thermos, and the moon coming up enormous and white over the ridge above the mine opening, May sat beside her in the doorway and ate from her bowl and looked at the sky. Are there coyotes out here? Yes. Are they dangerous? Not if we don't bother them. They're more scared of us than we are of them. May considered this. What else lives out here? Rabbits, lizards, probably some snakes, but they'll be gone for the winter soon. Hawks, maybe a few deer in the higher scrub. May leaned slightly against her mother's arm. It's quiet. It is. I kind of like it. Nora looked at her daughter's profile in the moonlight, at the serious, dark eyes taking in the desert with that new country attention children bring to unfamiliar landscapes. She felt the splinter shift again, the way it had in the Walmart parking lot when May had said 11 football fields. And this time, it shifted enough that she thought, maybe this. Is it safe here, Mama? Nora looked at the ridge above the mine opening, black against the moon-whitened sky. She thought about the lower room, about Raymond Coury's 30 years of regular visits, about a column of numbers that did not reconcile. We're going to make it safe, she said. That's the plan. May ate the last of her soup. Then she said, with the simple conviction of someone who has decided to believe something, okay, I believe you. The next morning, Nora walked to the mine entrance alone. May was still asleep, curled in her sleeping bag with the particular motionlessness of a child in deep rest, and Nora had been awake since 4 o'clock, with the cold and the silence and the particular amplitude that the mind achieves in the desert dark, turning things over, calculating, measuring. She stood in front of the orange fencing with her headlamp on and her father's work gloves on her hands and looked at the timber frame. She tested the frame posts with both hands, pressing laterally and then forward, feeling for flex or give that would indicate compromised structural integrity. The left post had some surface rot along its outer face, where decades of weather had worked at the wood, but its core was sound. The right post was harder, denser, possibly a different species of wood, and showed almost no deterioration. The header timber was massive, 12 inches by 12 inches, roughly hewn, and felt like iron beneath her gloves. She ducked under the orange fencing. The air inside the entrance changed immediately, cooler by 10 degrees, drier. It carried the smell of deep stone and mineral earth, a smell she had no prior reference for, but recognized in her body as ancient, as the smell of places that had been sealed from the world's surface long before she was born. And she moved the headlamp slowly across the ceiling, the walls, the floor. The first 20 feet of the mine were what the mining history articles called the adite, the horizontal entry passage cut at grade level, the corridor that provided access to the vertical shaft or deeper horizontal workings beyond. The walls here had been cut by hand, their surfaces showing the irregular facets of hammer and chisel work, and they were solid granite, barely changed from when Elias Hartwell had first cut through them in the 1880s. The ceiling was lower in the middle section, perhaps 6 feet, and Nora moved with her head angled slightly forward, the headlamp throwing shadows that rearranged themselves as she moved. The floor was dry, completely dry. This surprised her. She had expected moisture, seepage from the desert ground above, the kind of standing water that common sense suggested would accumulate in a sealed underground space over decades. But the floor was dust and fine gravel, and when she crouched and pressed her palm to it, it was cool and completely dry. She moved further. The adit ran approximately 60 feet, and at its end, the headlamp found what she had expected, the beginning of a descent. Rough-cut steps in the stone, each about 8 inches high and 12 inches deep, and 12 of them in a straight section before the passage angled slightly and the steps continued in the new direction. She stopped at the first step. She had read enough about abandoned mines to understand the risks: bad air, oxygen depleted, or methane-heavy atmospheres that could render a person unconscious within seconds of entering. Unstable overhead rock that had been stable for decades and could shift without warning. Shafts disguised by collapsed flooring. Water inundation in lower chambers. She carried a small lighter in her pocket. She flicked it and held it forward. The flame burned steadily, barely flickering. The air was moving. She could feel it against her face, a faint, cool draft drawing from somewhere below. Moving air meant circulation, which meant the atmosphere was exchanging with the surface, which reduced the risk of oxygen depletion or methane accumulation significantly. She stood at the top of the steps and looked down into the dark below the reach of her headlamp. The steps were cut from the same solid granite as the rest of the adit. The walls here were tight, close on both sides, close enough that she could have touched both simultaneously with her arms half extended. The ceiling was lower, 5 feet, maybe less. She would need to crouch. She thought about the lower room. She descended 6 steps. Stopped. Let her headlamp pan across the walls and ceiling. So solid. No cracks, no movement, no sound, but the faint, barely perceptible circulation of underground air. She descended 6 more. She was below the grade of the entrance now, perhaps 12 feet below the desert surface. The temperature had dropped another 5 degrees. The headlamp showed the steps continuing, angling slightly to follow the natural bedding plane of the granite. And on the wall to her right, at the level of her shoulder, she saw something that stopped her completely. It was a mark cut into the stone, not the irregular chipping of excavation work, not an accidental gouge or natural fault. Someone had taken an instrument, a cold chisel probably, or a fine-pointed mining pick, and cut a deliberate mark into the granite face. It was an arrow, 4 inches long, pointing downward along the direction of the descent. Below the arrow, a number, 60. Her headlamp stayed on it for a long moment. She thought of the water rights filing, the lower room, approximately 60 feet below grade. She thought of Raymond Coury, Nevada test site employee, regular visits, no income. She thought of her daughter asleep on the cabin floor in a sleeping bag, trustingly in a place they had come to because there was nowhere else to go. Because a woman who had run out of options had spent $1 on a hole in the ground. She stood in the cold ascending current of underground air and looked at the arrow and the number 60 and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not quite hope, which was too fragile a word for it, but something closer to the feeling she'd had as an accountant when a column finally reconciled after days of searching, when the number that had refused to make sense suddenly did, when the data aligned and the picture that emerged from it was clear and complete and true. She climbed back up the 12 steps. She emerged into the November morning, blinking in the white desert light. The ridge above the mine cast its shadow across the gravel floor of the small canyon, and the juniper at the canyon's edges moved slightly in the morning air. And somewhere above the ridge, a hawk turned in a thermal, with the unhurried patience of a creature that had no concept of urgency. She walked back to the cabin. She made coffee on the camp stove. She was sitting on the step with her cup when May emerged from the cabin doorway, hair uncombed, sleeping bag crease still on one cheek, holding her own cup, hot chocolate from a packet, with both hands and squinting at the morning. "Did you go in the mine?" "A little way." May sat beside her. "Is it safe?" Nora thought about the dry floor, the moving air, the solid granite walls, the arrow cut by a deliberate hand pointing 60 feet down toward a room that perhaps no one had entered in decades, perhaps in longer. "I think it might be," she said. "But we need to be careful. We need to learn it first. Like the desert. You have to know how to look." May sipped her hot chocolate. Then she said, with the same simple conviction she'd offered the night before, "Okay, then let's learn it." Nora looked at her daughter. She thought of Elias Hartwell cutting steps into solid granite by lamplight in 1884. She thought of Raymond Coury, a private man, a veteran, visiting this place for 30 years, and carrying something here that the world was not meant to know about. She thought of the lower room, 60 feet below the desert floor, 40 feet wide and 60 feet long, sealed and silent and waiting. She thought, "We are not done yet. We are, in fact, just beginning." She spent 3 days preparing before she went further. This was not caution for its own sake. This was the accountant's discipline, the habit of establishing a complete picture before drawing conclusions, applied to a context where the consequences of error were not a restatement, but a collapsed ceiling or a depleted air pocket or a fall in the dark. She read every document she could find about abandoned mine safety on her laptop, which she charged from the car's cigarette lighter in 30-minute increments to preserve the battery. She read about atmospheric testing, about structural indicators of instability, and about the difference between wet-set timber, which tended to shrink and crack as it dried over decades, and dry-set timber, which could remain structurally sound for a century under the right conditions. She drove back to Elko on the second day, May in the passenger seat reading her horse book. She went to the hardware store and bought a quality headlamp to replace her father's aging one, and a second headlamp for May, and extra batteries, and a length of nylon rope, and a small butane candle lighter that produced a consistent flame she could use for air quality checks. She bought a carbon monoxide detector of the kind used in residential gas systems, which she understood was not perfect, but would provide at least some warning of atmospheric compromise. She bought water, 2 gallons in jugs. She bought a first aid kit that was better than the dollar store version she had been carrying in the CRV. She spent $42. She did not think about the Visa balance. On the way back, May was quiet for 20 miles, looking out the window at the desert. Then she said, "Mama, what do you think is in there?" "What do you think?" May considered this seriously, the way she considered everything serious. Old mining stuff, maybe some old coins, maybe bones. Whose bones? Miners. People who died in there. Nora glanced at her. "Do you think there are bones?" "Maybe." May paused. "Is that scary?" "It would have been a long time ago. People who die a long time ago aren't scary anymore. They're just history." May nodded slowly, accepting this theology. Then, what do you hope is in there? Nora looked at the road ahead, the long, straight Nevada 2-lane running out through sage and stone toward the mountains. She thought about what she had read, thought about Elias Hartwell and his lower room, and Raymond Corey and his 30 years of secret visits, and the arrow and the number cut into granite by someone who wanted to leave a marker for whoever came after. She said, "I don't know yet, but I think something is. I think someone put something there and then either couldn't come back for it or decided to leave it for the right person." May thought about this for several miles. Then she said, "Do you think we're the right person?" Nora reached over and touched her daughter's hair, pushing it back from her forehead in the way she had been doing since May was an infant, the gesture so embedded in her hands that it happened before she decided to do it. "I think we might be," she said. "I think we just might be." They drove north into the Silver Basin country, into the high, clean air above the valley floor, toward the mine and the cabin and the 11 acres of desert that belonged to them and to no one else in the world. And in the granite ridge above the entrance, 60 feet below the surface of the Nevada desert, sealed and silent in the dark, something waited, as it had been waiting for a very long time. She went back into the mine on a Thursday morning, 10 days after they had moved onto the property. May was at school. Now Nora had established a routine around the school schedule that gave her structure in the way that working hours had once given her structure, a framework inside which the day had shape and sequence and could be trusted to proceed in a particular order. She drove May to the end of Silver Basin Road, where the school bus picked up, a 40-minute drive each way on the rutted caliche, and she used the driving time to think, to plan, and to make the kind of mental inventories that she had once applied to quarterly projections and that she now applied to the more immediate mathematics of survival. She had assessed the mine entrance again the previous afternoon, lying on her stomach at the top of the descent steps and lowering her arm as far as it would reach with the new headlamp, panning the light across the ceiling and walls of the shaft below. What she saw was encouraging in the specific way that things are encouraging when they are not as bad as they might have been. Solid granite on all surfaces, no visible fracture lines, no bulging or delamination that would suggest pressure from above, and the air current still moving steadily upward from the depths, cool and dry and clean enough that the lighter flame burned without hesitation or deviation. She had not yet told anyone about the arrow, about the number 60, about the lower room described in the 1891 water rights filing. She was not entirely sure why she had kept this to herself, except that she understood, in the particular way that people who have been repeatedly disappointed learn to understand things, that the distance between an interesting discovery and a significant one was vast and treacherous, and that hope shared prematurely had a way of becoming a kind of debt, something you owed to the people you had told it to, and something that cost you twice when it failed, once for the failure itself, and once for their disappointment, which arrived on top of your own and multiplied it. She told no one. She prepared carefully. And on a Thursday morning, with the desert sun still low and the granite ridge throwing a long blue shadow across the canyon floor, she ducked under the orange fencing and walked into the mine alone. She moved through the adit with the new headlamp throwing a clean white beam ahead of her. The carbon monoxide detector was clipped to the strap of her day pack, its green indicator light steady. She carried the nylon rope coiled on her shoulder, 2 water bottles, the first aid kit, and her father's work gloves. She had left a note on the folding table in the cabin. In the mine. Back by noon. Call Linda at this number if I'm not back by 2. She had written Linda's number from memory, then looked at the note for a moment before adding, May's school bus drops at 3:15. Please pick her up. She had then thought about this note for a long time, standing in the cabin with it in her hand. She had thought about what it meant to descend alone into a mine shaft on the basis of an arrow, and a number cut into a wall, and a researcher's century-old reference to a natural subsurface chamber, and a private man's 30 years of unexplained visits. And she had thought about May eating crackers one at a time in the Walmart parking lot. She had thought about, "Is it safe, Mama?" She had folded the note and set it on the table and gone. The steps were as she had left them, solid, dry, the slight mustiness of deep stone intensifying as she descended past the level where its connection to the surface air faded, and the atmosphere of the deeper shaft took over. 12 steps to the landing, where the shaft angled slightly. The arrow was there on the wall, exactly as she had left it, 4 inches of deliberate cut in the granite, pointing down, the number 60 beneath it in clean, cold certainty. She kept going. Below the landing, the steps continued their descent, cut with the same hand-chiseled precision as the upper section. She counted them as she went. 13, 14, 15. The walls pressed closer here, the shaft narrowing to perhaps 5 feet wide, then the ceiling dropping to where she had to duck her head by the 20th step. The headlamp showed water seep staining on the right wall, a dark vertical stripe where moisture had run at some point in the past, but the surface was dry to the touch, and the staining was old, its edges blurred by years of slow evaporation. 25 steps. She paused and checked the CO detector. Green. She flicked the lighter. Steady flame. She continued. 30 steps. The shaft widened slightly here, as though the miners had cut into a section of softer or more fractured rock that had allowed faster progress. She could feel the pressure change in her ears, the subtle drop in ambient pressure that came with depth, and she swallowed once, and the equalization happened cleanly, which meant the air column was connected and exchanging, which was what she needed it to be. 38 steps. She stopped. The shaft ended, not in collapse. Not in a wall of fallen rock or a cave-in or any of the obstruction she had mentally prepared for. It ended in a door. She stood at the bottom step and looked at it for a long moment, the headlamp's beam settling on something she had not expected and therefore had no immediate category for. It was a door set into the shaft wall, filling an opening cut in the granite that was precisely the width of the shaft and perhaps 6 feet tall. The door itself was steel, not the rough-edged iron of mining equipment, but machined steel, flat and true, set into a steel frame that had been mortared into the cut granite with professional precision. It had no decorative elements, no window, no external hinges. The hinges were concealed, internal, which meant the door opened inward. There was a single handle, a lever type in brushed steel, and beside the handle, a keyhole of a type she recognized as high security, requiring a key cut on both sides. And at the top of the door frame, pressed into the steel, with the deliberate permanence of a manufacturer's stamp, was a small embossed symbol, an oval with a triangle at its center, and beneath it, 4 letters. USGS, United States Geological Survey. Nora stood at the bottom of the mine shaft in the cold underground dark and looked at the USGS emblem on the door and thought about Raymond Coury, Nevada test site employee, a private man, had regular visits for 30 years, no documented income. And she thought about dispersal caches, and she thought about the Cold War and what a country afraid of atomic annihilation might have done with its most valuable things. And she thought about Elias Hartwell's lower room, 40 by 60 feet, 60 feet below grade, cut in solid granite, naturally sealed, naturally dry, the perfect vault. She stood there for a long time, long enough that her legs began to cool, and she shifted her weight from foot to maintain circulation. She looked at the keyhole. She looked at the lever handle. She put on her work gloves and reached out and pressed the lever down. The mechanism inside the door engaged with a sound like a bank vault. Not a click, but a sequence of clicks, internal, deliberate. The sound of precision engineering operating exactly as designed after however many years of sealed silence. She felt the lever reach its stop. She pulled. The door opened. Not easily. It was heavy. She guessed 40 or 50 pounds of steel, and its hinges protested with a sound that was not quite a squeal, but a deep resonant complaint, as though the metal remembered being closed and objected to the disruption of its long stillness. She leaned into the pull, both hands on the lever, her boots finding purchase on the rock floor of the shaft, and the door swung toward her in a long, slow arc that admitted a breath of the most peculiar air she had ever inhaled. It was dry, completely, absolutely dry. Drier than the mine shaft above, drier than the desert outside, dry in a way that had a physical presence, a kind of negative sensation, as though the air itself were drawing moisture from the surfaces it touched. And it was cold, noticeably colder than the shaft, perhaps 45 degrees, the kind of cold that a naturally sealed granite chamber at depth maintained through simple geological inertia, immune to the daily and seasonal temperature fluctuations of the world above. And beyond the dry, cold air, through the open door, her headlamp showed her the room. She understood immediately why Elias Hartwell had needed a water rights filing to describe it. It was not, in any mining context she had understood before this moment, a mine feature. It was not a stope or a winze or a crosscut or any of the technical vocabulary she had acquired in her research. It was simply a room, a natural chamber in the granite that Hartwell or someone before him had expanded and finished, its ceiling 8 feet above the floor, its walls cut smooth with tools she could not identify from the marks they left, its floor leveled with a precision that she recognized immediately as the work of someone who had intended to use this space for something that required a flat, stable surface. The room was approximately the dimensions described in the 1891 water rights filing, 40 feet wide, 60 feet long. The headlamp reached all 4 walls when she turned it slowly, and she could see the far wall clearly, could see the entirety of the space, could see what was in it. She stood in the doorway for a long time without entering. What was in the room was at first encounter not immediately comprehensible. Not because it was spectacular in the visual sense. It was not glittering or luminous or any of the things that the word treasure implied to a mind formed on fairy tales and adventure stories. It was organized. Systematically, professionally, obsessively organized in the way that a person trained in military logistics would organize a strategic cache, and what she was looking at was the result of that organization maintained across decades in conditions that had preserved everything within it almost perfectly. Along the left wall, arranged in rows from floor to ceiling on steel shelving units of the same institutional gray she associated with government storage facilities, were boxes. Metal boxes, sealed with gasket lids and lever latches of the type used for document and equipment storage in mid-century government applications. They were marked with stenciled codes in the nomenclature she recognized from her reading about the Nevada test site era, alphanumeric designations on a white ground that meant nothing to her specifically, but everything in their categorical organization. Along the right wall, arranged with the same systematic precision, were larger items, cases of a type she recognized from images she had seen in her research. The flat, home-reinforced carrying cases used to transport delicate items in field conditions, military-grade, aluminum-framed, foam-lined. Some were standard equipment dimensions. Others were the dimensions used for a specific type of transport container she had seen in the USGS historical archives she had accessed online, the type used for precious metals transport. and in the center of the room, arranged in a grid of 4 rows of 3, were 12 objects that she had seen before only in photographs. But they were roughly the size of a standard brick, cast in a dull yellowish metal that absorbed her headlamp's light rather than reflecting it, stamped on their upper faces with assay marks and a series of numbers that she could read from the doorway. Gold bars, not decorative, not symbolic, not the kind of prop that a person in a movie picked up and turned over with wide eyes. They were dense, slightly irregular, the product of industrial casting rather than refined manufacture. And they sat on a low steel platform in the center of the room with the absolute physical authority of something very heavy and very old. Nora Callaway stood in the doorway of the lower room, 60 feet below the Nevada desert, on an 11-acre property that she had purchased for $1, and she counted the bars. 12. Then she counted them again. 12. Then she looked at the boxes on the left wall and the cases on the right wall, and the cold, organized stillness of the chamber that Raymond Khoury had kept his secret for 30 years. Her legs gave way. She sat down on the stone floor of the shaft, just outside the open door, her back against the wall, her headlamp pointing at the ceiling of the shaft, and she breathed. In and out. In and out. The CO detector's green light blinked steadily at her shoulder. The air smelled of dry stone and cold metal and decades of sealed silence. She sat there for perhaps 10 minutes. Then she got up, because there was no one to sit with. May was at school, and there was no one else she had told. And the mind did not care how she felt about what she had found. And she walked into the room. She spent 2 hours in the lower room that first day, and she did not touch anything. This was the most difficult discipline she had ever applied to anything. More difficult than the nights in the parking lot. More difficult than the eviction notice. More difficult than the long months of building a life in pieces from insufficient materials. She walked the room's perimeter. She read the stencil codes on the metal boxes, most of which meant nothing to her, though she photographed everyone with her phone. She counted the aluminum cases along the right wall. 18. She photographed each one. She photographed the steel shelving, the floor, the ceiling, the door from both sides, the USGS emblem in its frame. She photographed the gold bars. There were 12 of them in the center formation. But there were more on the steel shelving along the left wall. She had missed them initially because they were in a different format, smaller, in sealed storage caddies of 5 bars each, stacked in 3 rows. She counted the caddies. 14. 14 caddies of 5 bars, 70 bars, plus the 12 in the center formation, 82 gold bars in total. She photographed each caddy. She photographed the stamps on the bars she could read without moving them. The stamps read, AU 99.5 fine, followed by a serial number and a weight designation she recognized. 400 troy ounces. She stood very still and did the arithmetic in her head, twice. 82 bars. 400 troy ounces each. At current market price, she looked it up on her phone, which had a single bar of signal, barely enough. Gold was trading at approximately $2,050 per troy ounce. She did the multiplication. She did it again. 82 bars times 400 troy ounces times $2,050. The number that came back was $67,240,000. $67 million. She stood in the center of the lower room, with the headlamp throwing its clean circle of light and the cold, dry air of the sealed granite chamber surrounding her. And she looked at this number on her phone's calculator, and she could not make it feel real. It was a number from a different category of existence, from the kind of life that was not her life, that had never been her life, so that she had watched from a professional distance when she was an accountant, and the hotel's cash reserves or investment portfolio appeared in the quarterly reports she filed, and the numbers were real. But they were not hers. They were institutional. They belonged to a system of which she was simply a component. She pocketed her phone. She turned and looked at the aluminum cases along the right wall. She walked to the nearest one. She crouched in front of it. The latches were the same lever type as the door, and they were not locked. The case was sealed, not secured, kept closed by the pressure differential inside the gasket seal rather than by any lock. She pressed the latches. They yielded. She lifted the lid. The interior was lined with custom-cut foam, the kind of precision foam packing used for instruments and equipment that could not tolerate vibration or impact. And set into the foam were objects she recognized immediately from a context she had not expected. Coins, not circulated currency, not pocket change, not the random accumulation of someone's spare coins pressed into a jar. These were collector's coins in protective holders, each holder labeled with a small card in neat handwriting. She picked up the nearest one. American Liberty Double Eagle. St. Gaudens design. 1927. DNG CMS 65. And she knew enough from her library research to recognize what she was looking at. The 1927 D. St. Gaudens Double Eagle was one of the rarest American coins in existence. The Denver Mint had struck fewer than 200,000 of them, and the majority had been recalled and melted during the Great Depression's gold seizure of 1933. Only a small number had survived, mostly in museum collections or private holdings that had evaded government recall. A single example in the condition indicated by the EMS 65 grade, mint state, essentially uncirculated, was worth, at the last documented auction she could find a reference to, approximately $1.8 million. There were 11 coins in this case. She closed the lid very carefully, the way you handle something that cannot be replaced if you drop it. She stood up. She looked at the 18 cases along the right wall. She thought, this is not $67 million. This is something else entirely. So she did not go back into the mine that day. She drove to pick up May from the school bus, and May got in the car and immediately said, "You look weird." "Do I?" "You look like something happened." "Did something happen?" Nora drove for a moment without answering. Then she said, "I found something in the mine today. I need to learn more about it before I tell you what it is. But I want you to know that it might be important. It might change things." May looked at her with the dark, serious eyes. "Good important or bad important?" "I think good. I think very good. But I need to be sure first. I don't want to tell you something and then have to take it back." May considered this for several miles of Caliche Road. Then she said, "Okay, I trust you." And this, the simple, unguarded trust of it, offered without conditions by a 7-year-old who had been given every reason to be more cautious, was what finally, in the car on the rutted road, with the desert spreading out on all sides in the afternoon light, made Nora cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the quiet, unmistakable leaking of something that had been held too long under too much pressure. And when May reached over and put her small hand on her mother's arm and said nothing at all, because she was 7 and she understood that some things did not need words, Nora pressed her lips together and drove on through the blur. And when it passed, she felt lighter than she had felt in years. She called Linda that night. Linda, who had lent her the truck, who asked few questions and gave practical answers, and who Nora trusted precisely because she did not perform trustworthiness. She simply exercised it. "Linda, I found something in the mine. Okay, something significant. I need to talk to someone who knows about. I need a lawyer. And I think I need a mining attorney. And maybe someone who knows about authenticating things, old things, valuable things." Linda was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How significant." Nora looked at the calculator on her phone, at the number she had written on a piece of paper beside it, the number she had checked 4 times. Very. Another pause. Then Linda said, "My neighbor's kid works for a law firm in Reno. Does property and estate work? You want his number?" "Yes." "And Nora, are you okay?" She looked across the dark cabin at May asleep in her sleeping bag. May, who had put her hand on Nora's arm and said nothing because she understood without words. May, who had eaten crackers one at a time and asked about 11 football fields and said, "I trust you," with the ease of someone who has decided believing is better than doubting. "I am," she said. "For the first time in a while, I actually think I am." The attorney's name was Marcus Webb, and he arrived in Elko on a Saturday morning in a gray sedan with a Nevada Bar Association sticker on the windshield and a briefcase that contained, as far as Nora could determine, mostly legal pads. He was 38 years old, methodical, with the careful precision of someone who believed that words had specific meanings and should be used accordingly. He had told her on the phone, "Before we discuss anything, I need you to understand that I cannot assess the legal situation without documentation. I need to see the property deed, the auction records, the original mining claim filing, and anything else that establishes chain of title." She had all of it. She had organized it the way she organized financial reports, chronologically, with a summary page and primary source documents behind it. Marcus had looked at the summary page and then at her and said, "You were an accountant." Yes, it shows. And he drove out to Silver Basin Road on Saturday morning with his legal pads and his careful precision and his sedan. And May sat on the step of the cabin and watched him park, and then watched her mother walk him to the mine entrance. And at the entrance, Nora showed him the USGS emblem on the door at the bottom of the shaft, and watched his expression change in the way that careful, precise people's expressions change when they encounter something that was not in their preparatory mental model. And he said, "We're going to need a lot of people out here." Nora said, "I know," he said. "Before that happens, we need to establish a very clear legal position. Mining claim ownership is specific. Personal property found on a mining claim is subject to different rules than real property. The federal government may have an interest depending on how this material was originally stored. The Nevada Unclaimed Property Act may apply. The USGS emblem on that door suggests federal involvement, which means we may be dealing with government property statutes on top of standard treasure trove law." He said all of this in the calm cadence of a person assembling a framework, not panicking, not speculating, just laying boards for a floor. Nora listened with her arms folded against the November cold, nodding at each point, her accountant's mind tracking the variables. She said, "What's our strongest position? Clear title to the real property, which we have. The auction deed is unambiguous and properly recorded. Whatever is in that chamber is on property you legally own. The question is whether the contents are personal property that transfers with the real property, government property that was stored here under some arrangement that creates federal claim, or abandoned property that may trigger specific Nevada statutes. What's the most likely?" He looked at the USGS emblem, at the steel door in the granite wall. He thought for a moment. And if this was a government cache established under informal arrangement with the prior owner, rather than through formal easement or lease, the government's claim may have lapsed. Federal abandoned property has specific reversion timelines. If Corey held the property in fee simple with no recorded government interest, and if no federal claim has been asserted within the statutory period after abandonment, he paused. "It's not the worst position I've ever seen." Nora looked at the door. "Are you saying we might have a legitimate claim?" I'm saying we have a starting position from which to negotiate or litigate. I'm also saying we need specialists, a federal property attorney, a mining claim expert, an appraiser or two, and ideally, some documentation of what exactly was put here and by whom and under what authority, which might be in those boxes on the shelves, and which might actually help your case rather than hurt it. She nodded. Who do I call? And he was already writing on the legal pad, his handwriting small and precise. I have a colleague in Reno who does federal property work. She's expensive, but she knows what she's doing. And I know an appraiser out of Las Vegas who handles estate and archival material, coins, metals, documents. He's discreet. Discreet matters, Nora said. Very much so. Marcus tore the page from the legal pad and handed it to her. For now, don't tell anyone else about this. Don't let anyone else into that chamber. Document everything you've already seen and share it only with the people on this list. She took the page. She thought of the real estate investors in the auction parking lot, the one who had said, "Lady just paid $12 for a hole in the ground." She said, "I understand." He looked at her for a moment with the measuring assessment of someone recalibrating an initial estimate. Then he said, "How long have you been living out here?" "Going on 3 weeks." He looked at the cabin, at the plastic sheeting over the windows, at the camp stove visible beside the door on its flat stone. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "You've handled this very carefully. I've had to be careful about a lot of things lately." He nodded. He looked at the mine entrance once more. Then he looked at May, who was still sitting on the cabin step, watching them with the dark, patient eyes. "Who is your daughter?" "May." "Has she been in the mine?" "Not below the audit. I kept her out." "Good. For now, I'd keep it that way." He closed his briefcase with a precise click. "I'll make some calls Monday morning. We should have a preliminary team out here within 10 days. The appraiser arrived on a Wednesday, 11 days later. His name was Daniel Cho, and he was 60 years old, with the compact economy of movement of someone who had spent decades handling objects that could not be replaced and had learned to translate this into a physical philosophy. He wore cotton gloves when he entered the lower room, and he carried a case of his own, a flat professional case in black nylon that contained, as he unpacked it with deliberate care, equipment Nora had not seen outside of documentary footage. A portable XRF analyzer for non-destructive elemental analysis of metals, an ultraviolet lamp for examining hallmarks and authentication details, a set of precision calipers, a portable scale calibrated to tenths of a gram, and a digital camera with a macro lens for close-range documentation. He looked at the room for a full 2 minutes before he touched anything. Then he walked the perimeter the way Nora had walked it, the way people walk spaces they intend to understand rather than simply see. He said, "Who built this room?" Nora said, "The original chamber was natural. I believe it was expanded by the original claim holder in the 1880s. The shelving and fittings were installed later, probably in the 1950s. He looked at the steel shelving, at the door, at the USGS emblem. He said, "Federal provenance, almost certainly." He crouched in front of the gold bar formation in the center of the room. He looked at the stamps. He did not yet touch. He said, "Do you know what 400 troy-ounce bars are sometimes called?" She shook her head. "Good delivery bars, the standard unit of wholesale gold trading. This format has been in use since the early 20th century. These stamps," he leaned closer, his flashlight at a low angle to read the marks. "These indicate a United States Assay Office certification, the Denver Assay Office, based on this format. Stamp style is consistent with 1940s to early 1960s production." "And the value?" He straightened. He looked at the 82 bars with an expression that was not excitement. Excitement was not, she understood, in his professional vocabulary, but something quieter and more absolute. At current spot price, what this quantity of gold at 400 troy ounces per bar represents, he paused, doing the arithmetic with practiced speed, approximately $67 million in gold alone. She had already done this calculation 4 times. Hearing it from his mouth in this room was different from reading it off a phone calculator. It was real in a different register. He said, "But that is not the primary value of this cash." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" He walked to the aluminum cases along the right wall. He selected one, checked its external markings, set it on a flat section of shelving, and opened it with the same reverent care she had used. He lifted the first coin in its protective holder. He held it under his ultraviolet lamp. He turned it in his gloved fingers. He said nothing for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he said, "This is a legitimate 1927 D. St. Gaudens double eagle. NG CMS 65 is the grade, which matches what I'm seeing. There were fewer than 180,000 minted. The overwhelming majority were melted in 1933. The number of surviving examples in this condition is..." He stopped. He set the coin down with careful deliberateness. He looked at Nora. He said, "Do you know what one of these sold for at Heritage Auctions in 2021? She said, "I found a reference to 1.8 million. He nodded slowly. That was a lower condition example. "This is MS-65, a coin in this condition, and this rarity at auction today," he paused, "would attract serious institutional interest. We're talking above 2 million per example under competitive bidding. There are 11 in this case alone," she said. He looked at the other 17 cases on the right wall. He looked at her. Then he said, "May I open the others?" It took 4 hours. Daniel Cho worked with the methodical patience of a man who understood that accuracy and speed existed in fundamental opposition and had long ago chosen accuracy. He opened each case in sequence, so documented the contents, ran the XRF analyzer on each item, recorded measurements and grades and provenance marks in his notebook with the small, precise handwriting of someone who wrote things down because he understood that memory, however good, was insufficient as a record. Nora sat against the chamber wall and watched and said nothing. May was at school. The CO detector blinked green. The mine was silent except for the soft sounds of Daniel Cho working and the occasional creak of the steel shelving as he moved cases on and off it. The coins in the cases were not all double eagles. There were Morgan silver dollars in proof condition, dating from 1879 through 1904, in holders that indicated top population grades, meaning, Daniel explained without being asked, fewer than 5 known examples in that condition for many of these dates. There were Liberty Head nickels from the 1880s. There were early American colonial-era coins in a condition that suggested they had been stored in ideal preservation conditions for the entirety of their existence. There were also, in 4 of the 18 cases, something that wasn't coins, documents. Nora had not opened these cases on her initial survey. They appeared on the exterior to be equipment cases of the same type as the others. When Daniel Cho opened them, they revealed interior configurations completely different from the coin storage. Flat document sleeves in archival polyester, stacked in neat rows, each sleeve containing what appeared to be a single document, preserved face up in the transparent protective enclosure. Daniel lifted the first sleeve carefully. He held it to his flashlight. He read. He set it down. He picked up the next one. He read that too. Then he stood very still for a moment. He said, "Mrs. Callaway, do you understand that the primary value of what is in this room may not be the gold or the coins?" She said, "What do you mean?" He held up the document sleeve so she could see its contents. It contained a single sheet of aged cream paper, handwritten in sepia ink, in a formal script that she associated with 19th century correspondence. She could read, from where she sat, a date in the upper right corner, 1847. And below it, a salutation. And below that, a body of text she could not read at this distance, and at the bottom, a signature. She moved closer. She looked at the signature. It read, A. Lincoln. She looked at Daniel Cho. He said very carefully, "This appears to be a personal letter written by Abraham Lincoln in 1847, during his single term in the House of Representatives. If authenticated, a document of this significance in this condition would be of considerable interest to—" He stopped himself. He said, "Let me look at the others." There were 47 documents in the 4 cases. They were not all Lincoln letters. They included what appeared to be a letter signed by Ulysses Grant, a document bearing the signature of William Sherman, several maps that appeared to be original surveying documents from the 1860s, hand-drawn on linen paper, bearing the marks of the Army Corps of Engineers. 2 sealed documents that Daniel Cho declined to open, saying only that their exterior markings suggested they should be assessed by a specialist in federal records provenance before anyone broke the seals. And in the final case, at the bottom of the last stack, a document that made Daniel Cho sit down on the stone floor of the lower room and remove his glasses and clean them carefully and replace them and look again. It was a letter, dated June 1863, on White House stationery, but signed in a hand she recognized from photographs. Everyone recognized from photographs, and addressed to a general whose name she did not immediately know. And its first line, which she could read even from where she stood, began, "I write to you in the strictest confidence regarding the arrangements we discussed for the preservation of certain federal assets in the event that the Capitol should fall." She read the first line again. She looked at Daniel Cho. He said, "Mrs. Callaway, I'm going to need to bring more specialists here." She said, "I know." He said, "I want you to understand what I'm looking at. Not just the metals, not just the coins. These documents, if they authenticate, and preliminary examination gives me no reason to believe they will not, represent an archive of federal historical material of extraordinary significance. The kind of material that institutions spend decades attempting to locate and never find." "How much?" she asked. "The total, or your best preliminary estimate." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the room, at the bars, the cases, the shelving with its government-coated boxes, the document sleeves, the sealed chambers, the cool, dry dark that had preserved all of this for longer than either of them had been alive. He said, "I cannot give you a final number. Coin values depend on auction dynamics. Document values depend on provenance authentication and institutional demand. The gold value is calculable. The combined value of a collection of this scope and rarity." He looked at her. "With the metals alone, you are above $67 million. The coin collection in this condition and composition, individual pieces alone, represent multiples of that. The documents, if they authenticate to the level I believe they will." He paused. He said, "I would not insult you by guessing." She said, "Give me a range." He looked at the room once more. Then he said, "Conservatively, at auction, accounting for market conditions and collection management fees and legal costs." He stopped and looked at her steadily. "The floor of this collection's value is above $200 million. The ceiling, if the documents authenticate at the level suggested by preliminary examination." He stopped again. He said, "I have never been in a room like this in my professional life." She stood in the lower room of the Hartwell mine, 60 feet below the Nevada desert, in a chamber that had been sealed for decades against a world that had no idea it existed, and the number Daniel Cho had placed on it settled through her like the cold, dry air of the chamber itself. Not as euphoria, not as the dramatic spike of emotion that the word treasure implied, but as something slower and more substantial, something closer to the feeling of a floor appearing under your feet after a long time of freefall. $298 million. That was the number Marcus Webb's team would eventually arrive at when the full authentication process was complete, when the specialists had been brought in, and the metals had been assayed, and the coins had been graded, and the documents had been examined under conditions that brought 3 separate forensic historians and a former Library of Congress archivist to Silver Basin Road over the following weeks. $298 million. Give or take. The legal process was complicated, as Marcus had predicted it would be, and the federal government did assert an interest in certain portions of the cash, specifically the documents with White House provenance, though this assertion would ultimately resolve differently than the government anticipated. But all of that came later. What happened first was simpler. Daniel Cho closed the document case. He stood up. He said, "I need you to secure this room. No one enters without your presence and mine until we have a legal framework in place." She said, "Yes." He said, "I want to be clear. This is going to become complicated very quickly. There will be people who want to contest your claim. There will be legal proceedings. There will be attention. Are you prepared for that?" She looked at the room, at the bars and the cases and the sealed chamber and the long, cold silence that had kept its secret for longer than anyone living had known. She thought of May on the cabin step asking, "Is it safe?" She thought of the parking lot and the crackers and the eviction notice and the 11 football fields and the $1 and the arrow pointing down in the dark. She said, "I have been preparing for a long time." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I believe you." She walked out of the lower room. She pulled the steel door closed behind her. The mechanism engaged with its sequence of precise internal clicks for the sound of a vault returning to its resting state. She climbed the 38 steps to the adit. She walked through the mine entrance and under the orange fencing and out into the Nevada afternoon, where the sun was low and the ridge threw its shadow across the canyon, and somewhere above the granite face, a hawk turned slow circles in the cooling air. She stood outside the mine and breathed. She took out her phone. She called Linda. Linda answered on the second ring. Nora said, "Linda, I need you to come out here. Bring May's favorite dinner, whatever it is. We need to celebrate something, and I need someone here who knows what the last 2 years were like. So it's real. So I know it's real." And Linda, who asked few questions and gave practical answers, said, "I'll bring tamales. She makes them herself, my neighbor does, best in Elko County." Nora said, "That's perfect." She put the phone in her pocket. She looked up at the hawk above the ridge. She thought of Elias Hartwell cutting steps into granite in 1884, leaving an arrow and a number for a person he would never know. She thought of Raymond Coury, a private man who had known something, protected something, kept a secret that the world was not ready for, and that he apparently believed the right person would eventually find. She thought, "I see you. Both of you. I see what you left." She walked back toward the cabin in the long afternoon light, in the cold, clean air of the high Nevada desert, on 11 acres that were hers, toward a daughter who was coming home from school and who would, tonight, finally learn what her mother had found. She went back into the mine on a Thursday morning, 10 days after they had moved onto the property. May was at school, for Nora had established a routine around the school schedule that gave her structure in the way that working hours had once given her structure. a framework inside which the day had shape and sequence and could be trusted to proceed in a particular order. She drove May to the end of Silver Basin Road, where the school bus picked up, a 40-minute drive each way on the rutted caliche, and she used the driving time to think, to plan, and to make the kind of mental inventories that she had once applied to quarterly projections, and that she now applied to the more immediate mathematics of survival. Linda arrived at 4:30 with a foil-wrapped tray of tamales that filled the cabin with a smell so warm and ordinary and human that Nora stood in the doorway for a moment, before saying anything, just breathing it in. And May came off the school bus at 3:15 with a drawing she had made of the cabin and the mine entrance and a hawk she had spotted from the bus window, and she had walked into the cabin and set the drawing on the folding table and looked at her mother's face and said, "Okay, you can tell me now." So Nora told her. She told her about the steps, about the arrow and the number 60, about the steel door with the USGS emblem. She told her about the room and the bars and the cases and Daniel Cho with his cotton gloves and his XRF analyzer and his professional precision cracking open case after case on the steel shelving, while the dry, cold air of the sealed chamber surrounded them. She told her about the coins and the documents and the signature at the bottom of the letter dated 1863, the signature that everybody recognized from photographs, the signature that had made Daniel Cho sit down on the stone floor and clean his glasses. May listened with her elbows on the table and her chin in her hands, and the dark, serious eyes moving over her mother's face with the focused attention she brought to everything that mattered. And when Nora finished, May was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Abraham Lincoln wrote a letter, and it was in our mine? It appears so." "For how long?" Nora said. "Probably since the 1950s. Someone Raymond Corey put it there. But the letter itself was written in 1863. May thought about this. She said, "That's before the Civil War was over." Nora felt a small shock of pride. "Yes, that's exactly right." May said, "Did he know the war was going to end?" "Nobody knew. That's what made the letter so remarkable. He was protecting things in case it didn't end the way he hoped." May looked at the drawing on the table, the hawk above the ridge drawn in careful crayon. Then she looked up. Are we rich now?" Nora looked at her daughter. She thought about all the careful ways she had learned to answer difficult questions, the protective translations, and the managed truths, and the way she had shaped information into shapes that a 7-year-old could hold without being hurt by the edges. She thought, "No more of that. Not tonight." She said, "We are going to be okay, really, genuinely okay, for the first time in a long time." May said, "Like, paying the bills okay? Or like, more than that?" "Like more than that," Nora said. And May, who was 7, and who had eaten crackers one at a time in a parking lot and asked questions that her mother could not always answer, and who had put her hand on her mother's arm in the car and said nothing because she understood that some moments were beyond words. May got up from the table and walked around it, and put her arms around her mother's waist, and pressed her face against her mother's shoulder, and said, "Good. I'm really glad." Nora held her daughter in the cabin that smelled of tamales and old wood, and the clean desert air coming through the plastic-sheeted windows. And she thought, this is the moment. Not the lower room with the bars and the cases and the sealed chamber. Not the number in Daniel Cho's careful voice. This, her daughter's arms around her waist, and the tamales on the folding table, and the hawk drawing, and the ordinary, extraordinary fact of being safe. When Linda knocked on the open door and came in with plates and her neighbor's salsa in a mason jar and sat down at the table without ceremony, the way Linda did everything, she looked at the two of them and said, Good news, then. Very good news, Nora said. Linda unwrapped the tamales. She said, "Tell me while we eat." The news reached Elko on a Thursday. It did not reach Elko the way Nora had intended it to reach Elko, which was carefully, through controlled legal channels and managed disclosure, in a sequence that Marcus Webb and his colleague, the federal property attorney, a woman named Sylvia Crane, who wore linen blazers and spoke in complete sentences of formidable precision, had mapped out across 4 whiteboards in a Reno conference room 6 weeks after Daniel Cho's initial appraisal. It reached Elko the way significant things reach small places, through a leak, a small one, a single thread pulled from the fabric of professional confidentiality, and the specific thread was a paralegal at Marcus Webb's firm who had a cousin who worked at the Elko Independent newspaper, and the cousin had mentioned to the newspaper's editor that something remarkable had apparently occurred at an abandoned mine on Silver Basin Road, and the editor, who had been in the news business for 31 years and recognized the sound of a real story when he heard it, had driven out to Silver Basin Road on a Wednesday afternoon and parked at the property boundary and taken several photographs of the cabin and the mine entrance and the orange fencing from the public road. The story ran on a Thursday under the headline, "Elko Woman Purchases Abandoned Mine for $1. County Assessor's Auction Yields Extraordinary Find." The story was careful with specifics because the editor knew enough about legal proceedings to stay close to the confirmed facts. But the confirmed facts were sufficient. A woman had purchased a tax-delinquent mining claim for $1 at auction, had moved onto the property with her young daughter, and had reportedly discovered contents of substantial value that were currently under legal review and appraisal. Nora learned the story had run when her phone began receiving calls from numbers she did not recognize, which she did not answer. And when May came home from school and said, "Everybody knows, Mama." Emily Soria said her mom showed her a newspaper article on her phone. Nora said, "What did you tell Emily?" "I said it was true that we live here. I didn't say anything else because you said to be careful." "That's exactly right." "Thank you." May said, "Are people going to come here?" Nora looked at the mine entrance, at the orange fencing that Daniel Cho had reinforced with a length of proper chain link and a padlocked gate after his initial assessment. She said, "Some people will try. We're going to make sure they can't." May said, "Is it safe, Mama?" "It's going to be," she said. "I promise." The calls began in earnest that weekend. They came from journalists, from treasure hunters, from investors, from historians, from a man who identified himself as a representative of a private collection institution in Geneva, who spoke with the careful enthusiasm of someone trying to get in front of an auction they had not been invited to. They came from a professor of American numismatic history at a university in Ohio, who left a voicemail that was 12 minutes long and contained, somewhere in its middle section, a very well-reasoned argument for why Nora should allow independent academic assessment of the coin collection before any auction process began. They came on a Tuesday from the man who had stood in the parking lot outside the county auction and said, "Lady just paid $12 for a hole in the ground." His name was Gary Pruitt. He was a Reno-based speculator whose LinkedIn profile described him as a land acquisition specialist, and he called Nora's phone from a blocked number that she answered by accident while attempting to reach Sylvia Crane, and when she realized who it was, she did not hang up. He said, "Ms. Callaway, I want to be straightforward with you. I've followed your situation since the county auction, and I think there's an opportunity here for a clean, fair transaction that protects both of us from the complexity of the legal process you're currently in." She said, "What kind of transaction?" He said, "I have buyers interested in the property itself, the claim, the land, whatever's on it. I can put $3 million in your hands within 30 days. Clean. No legal complications, no federal proceedings, no years of waiting." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You were at the county auction." "I was, yes." "You saw my bid." "I did." And she said, "Did you bid?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't see the value in that particular property at that time." She said, "At that time." She let that sit for one beat. Then she said, "Mr. Pruitt, I appreciate the call. I'm going to decline. Any future communication should go through my attorney." He said, "Ms. Callaway, I want to make sure you understand what you're dealing with. Federal property disputes can take years. The legal fees alone," she said. "I understand perfectly. Thank you." She ended the call. She opened her contacts and called Marcus Webb and told him about the call, and Marcus said, "Good. You handled it correctly. Don't speak to anyone without me or Sylvia present. We're getting close on the federal position." "What does close mean?" he said. "Sylvia believes the government's claim on the physical metals and coins is going to be very difficult to sustain. The property transferred in fee simple, without any recorded federal interest. No easement, no lease, to no lien, nothing. Khoury held clear title, and it passed through abandonment proceedings to the county and from the county to you. The government had decades to assert a claim and did not. And the documents? That's more nuanced. The letters with White House provenance. The government will argue those are federal records. But the act didn't exist in its current form when these were stored here. And we have a significant counter-argument that Sylvia thinks is very strong." He paused, and she said the Lincoln letter alone is going to be a fascinating legal argument. She said, "How do you feel about our position overall?" He said, "Better every week." The federal proceedings took 7 months. Nora had prepared herself for longer. She had prepared herself in the quiet, methodical way she had prepared for everything over the past several years. For the possibility that the legal process would be slow and expensive, and that the outcome was not guaranteed. That clear title and an unrecorded government interest, and the documented abandonment of the property, were strong positions, but not certainties. And that courts sometimes surprised you in the direction you had not expected. She had not prepared herself for how good Sylvia Crane was. Sylvia Crane had spent 23 years as a federal property attorney, 17 of those in private practice representing individuals and institutions against government claims, and she approached the Callaway case with the kind of focused professional joy that people bring to problems they have been specifically designed, by temperament and training, and decades of accumulated knowledge to solve. She filed 19 motions over 7 months. She deposed 4 federal officials. She obtained, through a Freedom of Information request, that she filed personally at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, because that was when she thought of it, a series of records from the Nevada Test Site Historical Archive that documented definitively that the Silver Basin Road Cache had been established in 1952 under an informal arrangement with Raymond Khoury that was never recorded, never filed, never registered as a federal interest against the property, and that the government official responsible for that arrangement had died in 1959 without ensuring the documentation of any federal claim. She said, in the Reno conference room where she presented this to Nora, they stored material on private property without any legal instrument securing their interest. The arrangement was oral. The official who made it is dead. The records showing the material was ever there were classified and only declassified in response to my FOIA request, and their declassification is arguably damaging to the government's position because they prove the government knew the material was there and failed to act. Nora said, "What does that mean for us?" Sylvia said, "It means the government's claim fails on abandonment grounds alone. There is no recorded interest. There is no active claim. There is nothing. The material in that chamber transferred with the real property under Nevada law, and it is yours." She paused. "No, the documents are going to require a separate negotiated agreement. The Lincoln letter in particular has cultural heritage implications that go beyond pure property law, and my recommendation will be that you and the government enter a joint custodial arrangement that allows the historical materials to be accessioned into the National Archives while you retain economic interest in their appraised value. But the medals and the coins—" She picked up her linen blazer from the chair and put it on and picked up her briefcase. "Those are yours. Full stop." The federal proceedings concluded on a Wednesday in late summer. Nora was in the cabin at Silver Basin Road when Marcus called with the news. She was sitting at the folding table, the same folding table she had brought from the storage unit 10 months earlier, the one that had been her desk and her kitchen table, and the surface on which she had organized the property records and the auction documents and the research she had printed from the library. And May was at school, and the desert outside the cabin window was pale gold in the late summer light, and the mine entrance was visible above the ridge with its reinforced gate and its new lock. Marcus said, "It's done. The order is signed. Full title confirmed. Federal claim dismissed with prejudice." She put down the sandwich she had been eating. She said, "Say that again." He said, "The order is signed, Nora. It's yours. All of it." She said, "All of it. Everything in that chamber, minus the cultural heritage agreement on the historical documents, which Sylvia has already drafted and which gives you fair market value assessment, plus a 10% ongoing interest in any revenue generated by public display of the materials by federal institutions. The gold, the coins, and the remaining non-government provenance documents. Yours. Clean title. No further federal interest." She looked out the window at the mine entrance, at the granite ridge above it, at the pale gold desert spreading out beyond the canyon's edge, in every direction under the Nevada sky. She said, "Thank you." He said, "You did the hard work. You researched the claim. You made the bid. You held the position while every kind of pressure was applied to make you fold. The legal team does its job, but the person who holds the line is the client. You held it." She said, "I learned to hold lines a while back." He said, "It shows." She told May that afternoon at the school bus stop, standing at the end of Silver Basin Road in the late summer heat, with the sage smell rising around them and the school bus trailing its dust cloud up the long, straight road from the valley below. May came down the bus steps with her backpack and her horse book and the particular expression she wore when she had been thinking about something for a long time and was ready to report on her conclusions. She said, "Mama, is it over?" "It's over. We won." May stopped walking. She stood on the Caliche Road and looked at her mother. Her expression cycled through something more internal, more private, a processing that Nora recognized as the same processing she had done herself on the phone with Marcus, the slow, necessary conversion of information into the emotional reality it represented, which took time because the information had been too large and too long awaited to simply absorb on contact. Then May said, "So we can stay here?" "Yes." "Like forever?" "As long as we want." May looked at the ridge above the mine entrance. She looked at the cabin. Or she looked at the desert, spreading out in every direction with its sage and its stone, and its hawks turning slow circles in the thermals above the canyon walls. She had been 7 when they arrived. She was 8 now, and the year had grown her in ways that Nora could see most clearly in exactly these moments, not in the obvious physical increments, but in the quality of her stillness, the depth of her attention, on the way she met difficult things without flinching because she had learned that you could meet difficult things without flinching and come through them. May said, "Okay, Good. Then she took her mother's hand, which she had not done unprompted in several months. Too old for it, usually, in the way of 8-year-olds constructing their independence. And they walked back up the road toward the cabin together in the late afternoon heat. And neither of them said anything else because nothing else needed to be said. The auction took place in November, 1 year and 3 weeks after Nora had bid $1 in the county conference room on Court Street. Heritage Auctions in Dallas handled the coins. They had spent 4 months preparing the catalog, photographing each piece, writing condition reports, and coordinating with the grading services that provided the final certified grades that would determine the bidding floor on each lot. The catalog ran to 231 pages. The cover featured the 1927 D. St. Gaudens double eagle in its holder, photographed on black velvet under a light that made the coin glow with the particular warmth of old gold. And when the catalog was released to registered bidders 6 weeks before the auction, the requests for registration came from 41 countries. Nora did not attend the auction in person. She watched it on a live stream from the cabin at Silver Basin Road, on a laptop that was no longer charged from the car's cigarette lighter. They had running electricity now, a solar array on the south-facing roof of the expanded cabin, installed by a company in Elko, whose owner had shaken Nora's hand when she paid the deposit and said simply, "Good for you." Aunt May sat beside her with hot chocolate and the old horse notebook, now nearly full, and watched the bidding numbers climb on the screen with the same focused attention she brought to things that mattered. The 1927 D Double Eagle opened at $1.4 million. It closed at $2.3 million. The room, Nora could hear it in the live stream audio, the specific quality of auction room silence that preceded the gavel, was completely still for the 2 seconds between the final bid and the hammer fall. And then the gavel came down, and May said, "Whoa." Nora said, yes. The Morgan Silver Dollar Collection sold as a single lot at $18.7 million. The complete Liberty Head Nickel Collection at $4.2 million. The remaining coin lots totaled $61.4 million across 47 lots. The gold bars had been handled separately, sold to a precious metals dealer in Zurich through a private transaction that Marcus and Sylvia had negotiated over 3 months. $6,1 million, reflecting a slight premium over spot for the historical certification marks and the provenance documentation that came with the sale. The Lincoln letter was not auctioned. It had been transferred to the National Archives under the Cultural Heritage Agreement, where it was accessioned into the permanent collection and scheduled for public display in the autumn of the following year. The National Archives' assessment of its fair market value, conducted by 3 independent appraisers over 2 months, came in at $4.7 million, of which Nora received the full amount as a condition of the agreement, plus the 10% ongoing revenue interest that Sylvia had negotiated. The remaining historical documents generated an additional $8.2 million in combined appraised value, with ongoing interest provisions on all materials designated for public display. The total. Marcus presented it in the Reno conference room on a December morning, 2 years to the month after Nora had received the eviction notice under the door of the Sunridge Apartments. He presented it on a single printed page, in the format she had long ago specified for financial reports. Clean, hierarchical, with a summary at the top and supporting detail below. She read the summary line. $298,400,000. Before legal fees and applicable taxes, both of which Sylvia and Marcus had been planning for since the first week, and which were substantial, but not ruinous. And after those deductions, the number was smaller. It was still a number from a different category of existence than any she had previously inhabited. She folded the page and put it in her blazer pocket, the good blazer, the one she had kept in the garment bag in the CRV through 19 nights in the parking lot, the one she wore now to meetings that were different in kind from any she had attended before. She said, Thank you. Both of you. Marcus said, Our pleasure. And he was not a man who said things he didn't mean, and he meant this. Sylvia said, Don't thank us yet. There's still the estate planning review next week. Nora said, I know. I've been reading about it. Sylvia looked at her over the edge of her linen blazer. I know you have. You've sent me 17 questions by email over the past 2 weeks. Nora said, I'll have more after the review. Sylvia said, I expect nothing less. She did not buy a house in Reno. She did not buy a house in Las Vegas or San Francisco or any of the cities that a person of sudden means was expected, by some unwritten social calculus, to migrate toward. She bought the 11 acres on Silver Basin Road. She had owned them since the auction, of course. They were hers from the moment Gerald the auctioneer had brought his gavel down on her $1 bid. But buying them felt different now. She walked the property with a surveyor in February, on the year after the federal proceedings concluded, and she stood at each corner marker and looked at the land that was hers from that marker to the next, and felt the ownership of it, not as a legal fact, but as something physical, the way the desert itself was physical, present, demanding, honest. She hired an architect, not to design something grand. She had no interest in grandeur, having learned in the parking lot that grandeur was a story people told about safety, and that safety itself was simpler and smaller than grandeur suggested. She hired an architect to design a house that was suited to the place, low to the ground, oriented to the south for passive solar, built of materials that belonged to the desert rather than being imposed on it. Stone and steel and glass, with wide overhangs for the summer sun, and excellent insulation for the winter cold, and a porch along the south face where you could sit in the evenings and watch the light change on the ridge. The mine was incorporated into the property plan as a heritage feature. The lower room, cleared of its original contents and professionally assessed for structural integrity, it was found to be exactly as sound as its granite construction suggested it should be, effectively a permanent feature of the landscape, as stable as the ridge itself. Nora had it properly ventilated, professionally lit, and designated in the property record as a historical feature of the Hartwell mining claim. She had a small interpretive sign placed at the mine entrance, written by a local historian she commissioned and reviewed herself for accuracy, so explaining the history of the claim from Elias Hartwell's original 1884, filing through Raymond Coury's stewardship to the present. She thought about both of them often. Elias Hartwell, who had come to this canyon in 1884, who had chipped steps into granite by lamplight and measured a natural chamber with rope and patience, and described it in a water rights filing as the lower room, as though naming it were the same as understanding it. Raymond Coury, who had served in a war and then worked on its aftermath in the desert, and had understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had seen what human civilization was capable of, that some things needed to be kept, and that the keeping of them required a place that the world did not know about. She thought, you both did something for a person you would never meet. You did not know it was me. John, you did not know it was a woman in a parking lot with a daughter and $48 in credit and a failing alternator and nowhere to go. You could not have known. But you left an arrow and a number and a sealed door and a room full of things worth preserving, and you left them for whoever was careful enough and desperate enough and thorough enough to find them. She left her own marker. It was not cut in granite. It was a provision in the trust she established with Sylvia's guidance, a portion of the collection's proceeds set aside in a permanent fund, administered by a board she chaired, directed specifically to emergency housing assistance for single parents in Elko County. The fund was named the Lower Room Foundation. When Marcus asked her why that name, she said, "Because that's what it was. A room below everything else, where the things that mattered were kept safe until the right person came along." But he said, "That's a good name." She said, "I thought so." The two men from the parking lot found out about it the way most people found out, through the newspaper. The Elko Independent ran the full story after the federal proceedings concluded, a front-page piece with photographs of the mine entrance and the property, and a photograph of Nora and May standing in front of the cabin. May's idea. May, who had decided at age 8 that she was not embarrassed by any of it, and that being photographed was fine, and that the hawk drawing she had made should be in the article too, which it was, reproduced in small as a sidebar. Gary Pruitt, the land acquisition specialist, who had offered $3 million for the property 30 days after the federal proceedings began, did not call again. She found out later from Marcus that he had made the same $3 million offer to 2 other people at the county auction, a routine maneuver in his speculative approach, and that none of them had produced anything, and that he had since pivoted to commercial real estate elsewhere. The other investor from the parking lot, the one who had laughed, had the grace to send a letter, handwritten, on plain notepaper, brief. It said, "Ms. Callaway, I was wrong in my assessment of your property, and I was unkind in my reaction to your purchase. I congratulate you, and I hope you and your daughter are well." She kept the letter. Not from bitterness. She had discovered, in the particular way that people discover things about themselves when circumstances give them room to breathe, that she was not a bitter person. She kept it because it was evidence of something she had come to believe with the certainty of lived experience, that the judgment of people who have not done the work is not a measure of the work's value, that the laughter in a parking lot says more about the person laughing than about the thing they are laughing at, that the world's assessment of what is worthless is not a fact about the thing. It is a fact about the limits of the people doing the assessing. But she kept the letter because it was a record of someone discovering those limits and having the integrity to acknowledge them. She filed it in the same folder as the auction paperwork, the property records, the handwritten note she had left in the cabin on the morning she descended into the mine. In the mine. Back by noon. She kept that note too. She had thought, in the weeks after the federal proceedings concluded, that she might throw it away, that it was a relic of a fear she no longer needed to carry. But she did not throw it away. She kept it because it was true, because it had been written by a woman who was genuinely uncertain whether she was coming back, who had left her daughter's pickup instructions in a note on a folding table in a cabin with plastic-sheeted windows, and who had gone down into the dark anyway. She thought that woman deserved to be remembered, not because of what she found, but because of what she did with the 38 steps before she found it. May turned 9 in the new house on Silver Basin Road in the spring after construction was completed. The house sat on the same footprint as the old cabin, oriented to the south as the architect had designed, with the wide overhangs and the stone and steel and the porch where you could watch the light change on the ridge. The mine entrance was visible from the porch, its gate closed and locked, its interpretive sign small and understated at the edge of the gravel path that led to it. Nora made the birthday cake herself. She had taken to cooking in a way she had not had the kitchen or the time or the margin of energy to do during the years of sustained emergency, and she found it had the same quality as the financial reporting she had once been good at. A specific, unsatisfying logic in which ingredients combined according to principles you could understand and trust, in which the result was predictable if you were careful and a disaster if you weren't, in which the work itself had a rhythm that her hands found comfortable. Linda came. Daniel Cho sent a card with a note that contained, in his small, precise handwriting, a brief update on a Morgan silver dollar from the Hartwell collection that had recently been acquired by the Smithsonian's numismatic division and was now on permanent display. The professor from Ohio, who had left the 12-minute voicemail, had eventually become a legitimate professional contact, and he sent a birthday book for May, a beautifully illustrated history of American coinage that May pronounced excellent and immediately began reading. Marcus and Sylvia came, which surprised Nora, though perhaps it should not have. They were not the kind of professionals who maintained a clean separation between their clients and their lives, and in the 7 months of federal proceedings, they had eaten more meals at Nora's folding table than at their own offices, and the relationship had settled into something that had the quality of friendship without requiring either party to name it as such. Sylvia brought wine. Marcus brought a telescope, a good one, and because May had mentioned once in passing that she wanted to see the stars better, and Marcus had written this down in the precise way he wrote everything down and acted on it 4 months later. They ate on the porch as the sun went down over the ridge, the desert going gold and then pink, and then the particular deep blue of Nevada twilight that arrived with a completeness that the light-polluted world of cities never achieved. May set up the telescope and pointed it at the first star, visible in the east, and looked through it with the serious, focused attention she brought to everything that mattered. And then she said, "Oh," and then said nothing else for several minutes, which was the appropriate response. Nora sat in the chair that she had placed at the west end of the porch, specifically for evenings like this, where you could put your back to the house and face the canyon and watch the sky go dark over the ridge. And she held her wine and breathed the sage smell rising from the cooling desert and thought about nothing in particular, which was a form of luxury she had not previously understood was a form of luxury. Linda sat beside her and said, "You seem different." Nora considered this. Different how? Like you're not braced for something. Nora said, "I spent 3 years braced. It takes a while to learn you don't have to be anymore." Linda said, "But you're learning." "Yes, I think I am." They watched May show Sylvia the telescope, and Sylvia, who prosecuted federal cases with the precision of a surgeon and the endurance of a marathon runner, bent to look through the eyepiece with the immediate delight of someone encountering something beautiful and new, and said, "Oh," exactly as May had said it. And May said, "Right?" and grinned with the particular radiant satisfaction of someone who has shown someone else something worth seeing. Nora watched her daughter and thought, This is what the lower room was for. Not the numbers in the report, not the auction totals or the legal victories or the final confirmation of title. This, a girl on a porch in the Nevada desert showing someone a star through a telescope, grinning because the world is large and beautiful and full of things worth seeing if you know how to look. She thought of Elias Hartwell, of Raymond Corey, of the arrow and the number 60 cut into granite by a careful hand. She thought, "I see what you meant. I understand what you were keeping it for," she thought. "Thank you." Later, after Linda had gone, and Sylvia and Marcus had made the long drive back to Reno, Nora and May sat on the porch with the telescope and the remaining light of a moon coming up over the eastern ridge, and May said, "Mama, do you think there are other places like this? Other mines with things in them?" Nora looked at the mine entrance, dark and locked above the canyon floor. "Probably," she said. "The world is full of things that have been put somewhere for safekeeping and then forgotten, or kept secret for reasons that made sense at the time, or lost because the person who knew where they were didn't live long enough to tell anyone." May thought about this. She said, "So how do you find them?" Nora said, "You do the work. You look carefully. You follow things that don't add up until they do." May said, "Like an accountant?" Nora smiled. "Exactly like an accountant." May looked through the telescope at something she had found in the east, something that satisfied her enough that she went still with attention. Then she said, without looking away from the eyepiece, "Mama, do you think someone put those things there for us?" Nora looked at the mine entrance, at the ridge above it, at the Nevada sky going deep and dense with stars the way it went out here, away from the lights of the valley, every star made distinct by the absence of anything competing with it. And she said, "I think someone put them there for the right person, and I think we turned out to be the right person." May considered this for a moment. Then she said, "Because we needed it most?" Nora said, "Because we were careful, because we did the work, because we didn't give up when everyone else would have." She paused. The needing was part of it. The needing made us look harder. But the looking is what found it. May was quiet. Then she said, "I'm going to be an accountant." Nora laughed. A full, a genuine, unguarded laugh, the kind that she had not had enough of in recent years, and that she had learned not to take for granted. She said, "You can be anything you want." May said, "I know, but accountants find things." The Lower Room Foundation held its first grant distribution in the spring, in a community center in Elko that still smelled of industrial carpet and fluorescent lights. Nora was on the grant committee. She had wanted to be in the room. She had specified it in the trust document. She wanted to see where it went. The first recipient was a woman named Carla, 29 years old, 2 children, recently displaced from her rental in Elko County, and sleeping in her car while working 2 part-time jobs that combined to something close to a living wage, but not close enough to a security deposit. The foundation's grant covered 6 months of housing, a security deposit, and a transitional support package that included childcare assistance, while Carla completed the accounting certification course she had enrolled in, but not been able to finish. Carla sat across the table from the committee and answered questions in the careful, slightly defensive register of someone who had learned that accepting help came with conditions and assessments and the subtle implication that you had failed in some way that required correction. Nora recognized the register immediately, from the inside. After the meeting, while the other committee members were gathering their materials, Nora stopped beside Carla and said, "I slept in my car for 19 nights with my daughter." Carla looked at her. Nora said, "Not long ago, on this same road, basically. Walmart parking lot on Idaho Street." Carla said, "I know the one." Nora said, "This is not charity. This is resources finding the person who will use them best. That's all." Carla was quiet for a moment. But then she said, "How do you know it's me?" Nora said, "Because you enrolled in the certification course before you applied for this grant. You were already doing the work. We just got you to the room." Carla looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded, with the precise, specific nod of someone who has received something they needed and is not going to diminish it by deflecting it. Nora drove home to Silver Basin Road in the late afternoon, from through the valley and up the rutted Kalisha and the 9 miles of unpaved road that she had learned the way she had learned everything out here, by repetition, by attention, by coming to know its particular qualities in every condition of weather and light. May was at school. The solar array was tracking west. The mine gate was closed and locked. She parked in front of the house and sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel. She thought about Carla. She thought about the certification course. She thought about resources finding the person who will use them best. She thought of $1 and a folding table and a note that said "in the mine" and the green light on the CO detector and the dry, cold air of the lower room and the particular weight of 82 gold bars and the deliberate cut of an arrow in granite and the number 60 pointing down into the dark. She thought of the splinter behind her sternum that had shifted and shifted, and finally, sometime in the year that changed everything, come free. She got out of the car. The sage smell rose around her, clean and sharp and old, the smell of a place that had been here longer than anyone, and would be here after everyone. She walked to the porch. She sat in the chair at the west end. She looked at the mine entrance, and the ridge, and the sky going gold above it. "Is it safe, Mama?" The question her daughter had asked at every threshold. At the mouth of the mine, at the edge of the unknown, in the parking lot and on the desert road, and in the moments when the future was uncertain and the ground felt thin beneath their feet. She looked at the hawk turning slow circles above the canyon. She looked at the house that was hers, and the land that was hers, and the mine that was hers, sealed and historic and permanent in its granite ridge. She looked at the world that had once seemed to be contracting around her and was now, unmistakably, wide open. Is it safe? Yes, she thought. Finally. Yes. She had gone into the dark with a headlamp and her father's work gloves and a note on a folding table and 38 steps of solid granite and the desperate, methodical, irreducible will to look at things that did not add up until they did. She had done it for May, and she had done it because she had run out of every other option, and $1 was $1, and an arrow on a wall was an arrow on a wall, and the numbers had not reconciled, and she was an accountant, and that was what accountants did. They found things, and the desert said nothing, which was its way of saying everything. And the hawk banked north into the last of the light, and the day settled into the deep Nevada dark that was full of stars if you knew how to look. And Nora Callaway sat on the porch of her house, on her land, above her mine, and breathed the sage smell and did not brace for anything. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.